Okay, so for part of your lesson plan submission for this module, you're just doing a select number of things inside your lesson plan, and those directions are given inside of Canvas about the specific aspects of the lesson plans that you need to complete for this first submission. So this video specifically talks about the writing of the learning objectives and the rationales, and those are two very separate things. The first thing I'll talk about is your learning objective, and then I'll follow it up with the rationale. Just as a reminder, your learning objectives and your rationales need to be based on your TEKS. So you should have picked your TEK first, your Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, from that website that I directed to you in the previous video. So once you picked your TEK, then you can write your learning objective and your rationale, because again, those things should be based on your TEK to begin with. So let's get started. With your learning objective needs to follow the ABCs. And so your A stands for audience, and your audience in this case, when you do your lesson plans and your learning objectives, is your students. So students become the audience in your learning objective. And so the start of your learning objective will read what you see here on the screen: the students will, or the students will be able to. So that's the first part of your learning objective. The B stands for the behavior. So the second part of your learning objective in the behavior is the learning action verb. So basically, what are the students going to show you? What are they going to be able to do? So the example that I provide for you here, the students will count from 1 to 20 becomes your behavior. So your behavior is not only the action verb or the learning verb, but it's also the thing that they're demonstrating. So they're counting from 1 to 20. They're reading the passage out of The Great Gatsby. They are picking out all of the action verbs in a document, and so it becomes the verb and it becomes the thing that they're doing. Also, with your learning objective or your behavior part of your learning objective, that behavior part needs to be a SMART behavior objective. So the S stands for specific and a single outcome. So inside your behavior part, you should really only be focusing on one thing, one specific attribute, not multiple things. So your learning objective needs to be focused on one observable behavior. So that is like counting, or it's finding grammar. It's not both of those things. So you need to limit that behavior part to one single outcome. The M stands for measurable. And so I'm going to provide you a list of verbs that are based on Bloom's taxonomy. And not all of the verbs that are listed in Bloom's taxonomy are directly measurable. So the question you need to ask yourself is, can I actually see the student doing this behavior? You can't really measure per se understanding or appreciation or even knowledge, but what you can measure is whether or not they can count from 1 to 20. What you can measure is whether or not they can pick out a verb within a sentence. So you need to be very careful with what type of verb you pick for your learning objective, because it needs to be directly measurable. And so the document that I provided here for your reference in your resource talks a little bit how you identify a measurable objective. What I also included for you was a few exercises that you could complete to help you practice with that, and I'm allowing you to turn that in for some extra points. The A part of that behavioral portion of the objective needs to be age appropriate. So just remember, and your TEKS will help with you with that aspect quite a bit, is that whatever you're asking the behavior of the child to do, it needs to be on level. It needs to be, if you're doing a 3rd grade lesson plan, it needs to be 3rd grade behavior. If you're doing a 10th grade lesson plan, it needs to be 10th grade behavior. So those verbs, again, where you can get the best guidance for that is through that TEK. The A part, it kind of goes with the age appropriateness. It needs to be realistic. And so realistic in this particular sense for your lesson plan is your lesson plan is supposed to encompass about an hour's worth of instructional time. So whatever your behavioral part of your objective is, needs to be realistic to that time frame, that it can be accomplished within that hour time frame. And then the T is the time boundness. And the time boundness in here again is that hour's worth of time. So whatever you choose to do, whether it's the math, the reading, art, physical education, it's got to be bound within that 1 hour time frame. And then lastly, so we did A is the audience, B is the behavior, C is for the condition. And what the condition is, the circumstances in which the student displays that behavior. So in the example that I've been using, the students will count from 1 to 20. Now you're saying how they're going to show. So The behavior is what they're going to do, and the condition is how they're going to do that or how they're going to show that behavior. So in this particular example, I'm just giving you using the bare manipulatives in the math station. So they're going to count from 1 to 20 using those bare manipulatives that are located in the math station. So in total, your objective needs to be this specific and clear. You start with your audience, the students. You're going to count from 1 to 20. That's your behavior. And the condition is using the bare manipulatives and the math station. So your learning objective for each one of your lessons needs to contain this A, B, and C, each parts of the learning objective. And as a few reminders, again, your learning objective does need to be based on the TEKS. So you have to start there first. And then you need to focus on the one main verb and not have multiple verbs and multiple behaviors inside the learning objective. Now moving on to rationale, your rationale is going to look different than your learning objective because the rationale should be broader. It's still based on the learning objective, but you kind of think of it as a more holistic, what's the purpose of this lesson versus the specific measurable outcome. So in this case, the rationales can be quite broad, and they can use verbs that aren't directly measurable or observable. So some of those verbs that you could use in your rationale, I'll get to here in a second, but here's how I'd like to start off, have you start off your rationale is the purpose of the lesson is. So that's really what the rationale does, is it guides you as a teacher and anybody else reading your lesson to kind of focus it back to, okay, what is the purpose of the lesson? All right, so they're counting from 1 to 20, but why? What's the purpose of that? And so that's what the rationale leads you back to is the purpose of the lesson. So some of those sample verbs that you can use within your rationale is appreciate, understand, enjoy, learn, know. So in the rationale, you can use some of those verbs that aren't necessarily directly measurable or observable, but they're more of that kind of broad understanding. And again, it does need to encompass the learning objective. So if your learning objective is about counting, then your rationale needs to reflect some math or counting kind of aspect and what the purpose of that is. So your rationale can't be so broad that it's the purpose of the lesson is for the student to learn math. It's got to be more specific than that, but we're looking at a broader sense.